During this course, we are focused on two-point perspective. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between 1 and 2 and 3-point perspective as we progress, but the main thing to think about when drawing in perspective is that as things get further away, they get smaller. We see them as getting smaller. And so that is called foreshortening. One of the other main concepts in two-point perspective is that you've got a horizon line, and that horizon line is at eye level. On the top of this page, you'll see we have a character. From the eye, you've got a picture plane. And we think about our paper is going to be this picture plane, but as we look at this and we see these different points, this person is looking at this center cube, at least right now. And as she looks at this cube through the picture plane, notice that these two corners are lined up. These two are to the outside. One of the other things to notice is that because she is above this cube, she'll see the top surface of the cube. And the sides of the cube are going to foreshorten. Now, two-point perspective, and this is somewhat to make things easy and make things kind of easier for the reader to understand, all the vertical lines, all the lines that are straight up and down, should be straight up and down on your drawing. If there are lines that are parallel in reality with one another, they will vanish towards the same left and right vanishing point. The other thing to notice about this drawing is the orientation of each of these cubes, the angular orientation relative to the picture plane. These are at 45 degrees. We'll talk about how that changes in a subsequent exercise if an object is not at 45 degrees. But one, for starting out and thinking about cubes, which become a foundational element in sketching in perspective, we're going to start with this cube that is right in the middle of our picture plane, and it's at a perfect 45 degree angle. So notice on this drawing that means that it's sitting right in between my left vanishing point, and go ahead and label this as your right vanishing point. I hope I'm not infringing on copyright, but our eye level is the horizon line, but right in the middle of that, so in between the left and right vanishing point, we have what I'll call the horizon line. And that becomes important as we start to think about how we want our drawing to be set up, whether we want something to sit at 45 degrees or whether we want it at a different angle to show off a better view. But notice that each of these parallel lines go to a vanishing point, and all of these are straight up and down. So we're drawing 3 cubes. Well, we've got one drawn. We're going to draw this right and left cube on this page. So go ahead and grab, I want you to use a ballpoint pen, but go ahead and grab a straight edge, and we're going to draw another cube over to, we'll start with this one over to the right of this one. I like to draw the leading edge, that front edge of a cube first. I'm going to make it about the same size as this one. And I notice that I put some heavy line weight. Now that's medium to heavy line weight. I know that's the front edge of my cube, and I'm confident that that's what I want. But as I begin to put in these construction lines, I'm going to use that really light pressure, light line weight. And I'll come back in and fix some of these, but I'm basically from the top edge of that, the top point of that line and the bottom point, I'm going to draw a couple of lines to my vanishing points. And so that's going to tell me my rate of convergence. One thing also to note here is with that cube that's right in the middle, I see both the left and the right side equally. I draw them to be that same size. When we start to move over to one side or the other of this horizon line, look at this dimension versus this one. I'm actually, and here's where we would actually see it on that picture plane or our paper. This side, I'm going to see more of this side than I see of this side. And so, and in fact, that distance right there is a little bit wider than this distance right here. So I know that it needs to be a little bit wider than that. We'll get into proportion, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the 3 cube rules in a minute. But right now I'm evaluating this distance versus this distance, and I'm going to make this a little bit wider. Drop in a line, and I'll make this side smaller because I see less of it. And this is something that will come with time. It's not as easy to see until you put these back edges on. So when I look at that, it's difficult for me to evaluate whether or not that looks right. And that's the goal of perspective drawing, is to draw something so that it looks correct. We're fudging the distances, and some of this is just intuition, but we want it to look right. But I can't until I draw the top edges of this cube, top back edges of this cube. It's difficult for me to evaluate whether or not that looks like a square yet. So I'm going to come from this back corner over to the left vanishing point. I'm going to come from this corner over to the right vanishing point. Now I can look at that and I can imagine, does that look like a square? And I think that one does. That looks pretty good to me. So one of the difficult things as we get started is to develop that eye. It would be difficult for me to count the number of cubes that I've drawn, especially since starting to teach this perspective stuff. And so it's difficult for me to imagine what people who are just getting started see when they see that. But those two things that we just talked about on this drawing become the key and the foundation for drawing in perspective. You want to get the perspective and the convergence correct, which having these vanishing points on our page, we'll refer to that as training wheels. That helps with that. The thing that you have to guess on here is the proportion. So getting perspective right and getting proportion right, those are the key things to drawing perspective drawings. So let's do another cube over here. Note, the closer that I get to that vanishing point, be careful not to go too close. The more distorted my cube will look. So it looks the least amount of distortion right here, and the most amount as it moves over here. And in fact, what would happen, if my cube went over and sat in front of this vanishing point, it would become a one-point perspective drawing. Top and bottom of the line, leading edge first. From the top and bottom, I'm just going to go to each vanishing point. Because this is about the same distance off that horizon line, this cube will basically be almost a mirror image of that. If I got this line the same length and the same distance away, it would be a mirror image. So just like I thought about earlier, I want to see more of this side, right? I want to see more of that than of what's out here, and in fact more of that than I see here. So let me draw this line in. Put that there. From where this meets and this meets, I'm going to go to these vanishing points. And when I look at that, that proportion seems just a little off. It seems like I need this line to come in ever so slightly. now I'll clean this up just a little bit. With darker lines. Little bit of a mistake there. And I'm not at all worried about this extra line that I have drawn in there, that extra construction line. The last thing that we want to do for this exercise is let's put 2 cubes above the horizon line. And so I'm just going to draw, let's do one that is a little bit smaller and one that is a little bit larger. So let's put a larger one right here and just see what happens. So leading edge, okay, which side will I see more of? Well, I'll see the entire side, but which one will look a little bit larger? And because it's moving over to the left, I'm going to see more of the right side. It kind of falls into this category. Of course, this is now above my horizon line, so this cube will be above eye level, and that means that I'll see the front 2 surfaces and the bottom surface as opposed to the top surface. But I need to guess. Let's see. One common mistake that people make when they first get into drawing the proportion of cubes is they'll make these surfaces too large. Although it does look like I need this one to be a little bit larger. And then I'll see less of this side, or it'll look smaller. The width will look a little smaller. And again, it's hard for me to evaluate until I put these last 2 edges in. And my goal is to develop the eye that tells me, you know what, that cube looks a little too tall. And I can correct that in a couple of ways. In this instance, the easiest thing for me to do is probably just adjust the height of the cube. So I could pull this line down. Pull this line down. And now I'm looking at that. Looks a little better. I think I actually need to add some distance out here. Let's try that. Darken in my object lines to make them stand out from those construction lines. Okay, now I'm going to play with the orientation here. This is what's fun about perspective. I want 2 cubes that are somewhat lined up next to one another. So I've drawn a cube that maybe sits, maybe sits in this area above the horizon line. And I'm going to draw another cube that's about right here. So it's further away from me. It's getting smaller, but it's in line. So these two surfaces are in line with one another. And it's going to be behind this one. And this is where perspective is so much more powerful than just drawing orthographic. I'm going to hide some of this cube I will not see. There's my leading edge. This one is, the leading edge is just to the right of my horizon line, so I'm going to see a little bit more of this surface and a little bit less of that surface. I always like to draw the larger surface first. And so it's going to be somewhere about right there. Okay, there's one last thing I want to do that's applying some of what we learned earlier to this drawing. And that is, I'm going to apply some of that hatching technique. And so, kind of by default, and hatching can help me visualize the form through applying some value. And oftentimes, if I'm just drawing something below the horizon line, like these three cubes, I'll just pick one surface to hatch. But because we have some stuff above the horizon line, I'm actually going to hatch two of these surfaces. These I'm only just going to hatch one. By default, I always think about a light source coming in from above and over my left shoulder coming in. And so what's happening is it's hitting this edge pretty hard. But these two surfaces are going to be about the same value. They're going to be brighter. And then this surface to the right is going to have a little less value. And so, or it's going to have a darker value. So I like to just hatch one surface. Do the same thing here. Trying to be consistent. This is it's a light to medium pressure. I don't want this to overwhelm my drawing. So that's below the horizon line. Up above the horizon line, the same right facing surface, I'm going to give the same value as those right surfaces below the horizon line. But here I am going to hatch the bottom surface of these cubes with a darker value. So I can either put more pressure or I'm going to put the lines closer together to make that a darker value. Notice the angle. Now, it's somewhat arbitrary. Some people like to hatch it at an angle that works with their drawing. I prefer for the hatching angle to be not interfering with other angles on my drawing. For some reason, for bottom surfaces, I always like to just put, it's a vertical hatch. Notice the angle of my paper. I'm trying to make this as easy as possible. Also notice I'm drawing like 3 or 4 lines, and then I'll pick my hand up and plant it, anchor it somewhere else, and then I'll move the page. So most of this I don't even think about anymore. It's second nature for me to do these these little techniques that help my drawing out, like moving my hand, moving the paper, rotating the paper to the proper orientation, all those things that we worked on in that first exercise, they're somewhat second nature to me. It's difficult for me to think about them, but that's only because I've been doing this for a very long time.